So we're recording. This is the Coach Support Show where science meets strategy. And today we're going to start with a paper.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 2. Yeah, so John, I was reading around the topic of leadership stemming from our conversation last week. And however the world works, I found an interesting article, or it popped up on my LinkedIn feed. The paper is called Zombie Leadership, Dead Ideas That Still Walk Among Us, by a number of authors, but led by Alexander Haslam from the University of Queensland in Australia. And this paper caught my attention because it's not strictly speaking about coaching, but I think we would, of course, suggest that there is probably an element of leadership within the work of a coach and within the process of coaching. And this paper highlighted a number of things that maybe we should think more about when it comes to coaching and how we look at coaches and their role. And I thought some of it might be interesting to discuss within the context of esports. I wonder, first of all, do you have a standout leadership quote that springs to mind?
Not off the top of my head. I have a bunch of different quotes that I like and I use a lot, but they're mostly around performance or coaching more specifically. That's actually one of the
Right.
things that I wanted to talk about when we get there is there's a definition of leadership in this summary that would be interesting to kind of dissect. So we'll save that
Yeah.
for a little bit later. But what are then these dead
These zombie
leadership
ideas.
claims that are still walking around?
So that's kind of why I asked about the quote, because if anyone's listening, I'd invite them to think about if you have a prominent quote about leadership that you like and that inspires you. They often position the leader as this inspirational figure that just galvanizes the best in a group or in an individual. And there have been lots of attempts in academic settings to define leadership, and a lot of them sort of suggest that it's an inherently good thing that one individual just has these amazing traits of this, that, and the other that we see as leadership. And this paper essentially drew attention to some ideas that, when you really think about it, can't really be that way. So, just to summarize some of these points, 4 key claims. So, only leaders can lead. Leaders have qualities that set them apart from ordinary people. That links to a relatively old theory that is termed the great man theory of leadership, that we're like sort of great leaders are born and not made. Group success should be attributed to leaders, and history is ultimately the story of great leaders. And why this is interesting, I think, is that the whole paper, the ethos of the paper, is essentially that leadership cannot take place without followers in the picture or without others in the picture. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence or defining set of characteristics that you could identify a leader independent of the group or the individual that leader works with. So it's not that we have a strong body of scientific evidence to say that a particular personality trait, for example, is characteristic of great leadership, rather that great leadership takes place within a context, within a team. And so one idea that just won't die is that you have someone that embodies leadership and great leadership, and you could put them into any group and they would do well. And just if you break that down, it makes a lot of sense, because every group is going to have slightly different features, needs, demands, stages of development, this, that, and the other. And without giving away the end, it's a really interesting paper just to think about and lead. It could be something where you think, well, it doesn't really matter. But the paper sort of argues that if we don't think about it and take it seriously and really put this idea to bed, it might become true that actually we start to look at these leaders that we install as being just like the embodiment of leadership, and actually we start it sort of becomes the reality in some sense. Like, groups tend to bend to the will of these new leaders that are coming in. And this led me down lots of rabbit holes of reading and trying to get to sort of interdisciplinary view of leadership and good leadership and leadership effectiveness, which links to things like coaching effectiveness, this term effectiveness, and the difficulties of defining all that. But just before we go into any of that, does this idea resonate with
Yeah.
anything you're thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is definitely worth constantly talking about this, even though people who are paying attention might feel like it's almost redundant to speak about. But I
Right.
would definitely not assume that that's the case, even when it comes to we won't we won't open the can of worms that is leadership and management in outside of esports. We'll stick in esports for now,
Right.
but even there, I think it is worth to keep talking about these things. And there's a lot of things that potentially people like us, and ironically, probably preaching to the choir a bit, someone who's going to go out of their way to listen to a podcast about talking about coaching theory probably also thinks that these ideas are maybe a bit too almost too simple to be discussed is not the right word, but they are already dead and buried. But I don't think they are at all. However, one of the things that I thought would be interesting to do when we were preparing for this is maybe be a little bit of a devil's advocate on some of these
Right.
points. And maybe actually even the first claim, I mean the stuff so the first claim being only leaders can lead. For me, this is maybe a little bit different from how you summarized it. I was interpreting that as like you can't teach people how to be leaders.
Hmm.
I would say absolutely. I think you can, but again, I'm sort of pushing it just to hear your response. Is that also true that you can teach leadership on a short timeline? Because in terms of the theory, and if you bring in people like yourself to a team, it's like, right, we could teach anyone to be a good leader. However, we don't get the chance to work with people for years before they could get to be a good leader. If you're at a professional team, if you're at a professional level, you kind of already need to be a good leader. And especially as most coaches in esports haven't had any kind of training, let alone any kind of formal training, it is the people who are naturally better leaders who do become better or more effective coaches. So, do you think that this only leaders can lead thing is a dead claim, even if, with those caveats, even if a short period of time, even if it has to be immediately you're up against other people, it's a direct competition space. You can't have 6 months of your 1 year contract where your coach is gradually learning the skills of leadership. They need to already be at that level. So do you
Hmm.
think it's still dead in that context?
I think I'm on board with your. This is a good devil's advocate starting point, because if if it if it was the case that anyone can be a leader, why is it so difficult to develop leaders? So we know in I was actually reading about this morning in context outside of esports, sport certainly, the military, in healthcare. There's a lot of money, big money thrown at leadership development programs to develop better leaders in those contexts, and huge amounts of sums are thrown at these projects, and it seems to be very, very difficult to teach leaders and create better leaders. And that could be one point in the column of, leaders are born and not made because it's so hard to make them. And actually, you might just have people that are more inclined to be good leaders and they possess something, we just haven't figured out what it is yet. But I would then also probably counter that with it's probably more the methods with which we've tried to develop leaders so far. So not all my own thinking, but a lot of people in the world of academia have tried to evaluate development programs, and a lot of them suggest that when they're completely removed from the context, they are they're not very impactful. So the more you can do to mentor people in practice, you can link educational training to actually what's going on in their specific context. So that could be as granular as what's going on within that specific team. Could you even invite the team to be part of the leaders development? So could you invite the head coach and the 5 league players and the manager to sit around a table and discuss the coaching? And
Mm,
of course that would require huge amounts of trust, but that is probably where development programs need to go to be ultimately
mm,
really effective and long lasting. But at the moment, we have a lot of measures of development programs where it's you sort of look at the lower level evaluation points. So, did you enjoy being part of these standalone workshops? Yes, I enjoyed it, but that doesn't necessarily carry over into you're a better
Yeah,
coach,
yeah.
better leader. So I can get on board with the devil's advocate that maybe
Mm.
there are people that are more inclined,
Yeah. It could
but also it's
be
difficult.
again, I do think on like a long timeline, I think you can absolutely change all the things like that. I think the way we behave is, or the way we are, is just a series of behaviors, and you can change your behavior. It's just the habits that you built up. But I do think that we have to bear in mind that in esports, in a professional context, you will need results quickly. The thing that I would say on that, it sort of reminds me, I've completely spaced at who said this first at one point, but there's this phrase among sprinting coaches, which sort of applies to different levels in different sports, which is I can make you faster, I can't make you fast. Like you need a certain level before even having a sprint coach is going to kind of matter. Not everyone could run as fast as Usain Bolt if we just trained like him, but we would get we would get substantially faster. But you sort of need that certain level, and maybe I mean that's been the case really for me over the last few years working with coaches from all levels, people who've been doing it for a decade but also people who are just starting. Everyone can get better, and I think most people would be amazed at how quickly they get better by just having someone to be there to put the effort in with. So yeah, I do think your leadership ability can increase dramatically really really quickly, which is of
Hmm.
course what we want in esports, and actually is probably some of the best use of your time as an organization in terms of where you should look to be developing the people that you've got.
Yeah.
But I do think we should always keep in mind that I don't think you could just say, right, anyone could be a leader or do this thing of kind of any player when they retire. It's like, well, do you want to be a coach? I think that's a slightly more dangerous dangerous proposition, and it depends of course what kind of coach and what kind of responsibilities they would have, but that one is I think a little bit dangerous as well, where I think actually in the context that we have, sometimes you do just need to say, look, we don't have the time to turn this person into a leader. It has to just
Hmm.
be someone.
Yeah. So another reflection to discuss with you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this one. The idea that having a leader makes a group better.
Hmm.
So there's another. I found this quote on social media. Unfortunately, I don't know the speaker, Peter Drucker, but the quote is: "Only three things happen naturally in an organization: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership." And I, I, it echoes kind of a sentiment in this paper that actually that every group needs a leader, and having a leader will make them more effective, and certainly than without having a leader.
Mm.
Initial
I
thoughts?
yeah, I agree with that. But the thing that I would say as a kind of extra caveat is he doesn't say a leader. He says leadership,
Right.
which I think is
Nice.
actually quite an interesting one for me. And I'm a massive believer in the fact that everyone should be kind of leading in certain situations, and everyone should be part of that process, and everyone should
Hmm.
have areas that they're responsible for. You know, we talk about last time we talked about motivation and making sure people have autonomy and control of what they're doing. And I think it comes to that as well. Where if you think about a
Yeah.
team, I actually think it's really, really useful to talk a little bit more about the responsibilities that players have rather than the privileges that they have. Now, it's not so much of an issue now, but especially when the LEC first started, there was this massive boom of money. It was so much like, okay, what's this all going to do for me? Like, are they going to provide me this thing and all my food sorted out? And also, I don't like the tap water, so a water dispenser, and also it has to be chilled because I don't like my water to be like room temperature and all this kind of stuff. And it was constantly, what are my privileges as a player? And we never talked about the other side of that coin of like, okay, but what's my responsibility as a player? And I actually think that's a lot more powerful. And saying, okay, if we're in an organization, especially if we're in an organization that doesn't have like loads of individual coaches, let's say, it's your
Mm.
responsibility as a player to be the best in that role in the organization. Like you have to know the most about the top lane meta if you're our top laner. And we'll give you the tools to do that as coaches. We'll provide you analysts who you can ask any questions from, all this kind of thing. But it shouldn't be the situation where they're coming to you and saying, here's some new things, here's some, try this and do that. It should instead be almost the other way around, where you're saying, right, for me to lead as in this area, I need these and these things. So, for example, whenever there's a new champion that comes out, I think it's great practice to get the player who that champion's role is primarily to teach the rest of the team about it. It's your responsibility to know this new mid laner, and you should know it better than anyone else because you're responsible for knowing your role better than anyone else. So you should be
Yeah.
teaching everyone about that. And so I love that idea. I can't remember the exact three things, but it definitely did seem to strike very true. But
Yeah.
importantly, leadership rather than a leader.
Yes. So it was friction, well, friction, confusion, and underperformance, and
Mm,
we've both definitely been in team situations where friction and confusion
yes.
reigns
It,
supreme.
yeah,
But
it reminds me actually, I won't say who because this will come out first. Yesterday, I recorded an episode of Coach Talk with a fantastic guest. It was an amazing conversation. One of the things he said as his non negotiables, hope I don't butcher this now that it's going to be out and online and you can check if I've got this right. But it was like the ability to coach yourself, the ability to
mhm,
lead yourself, to improve yourself.
yes,
That has to be something that we all buy into. And I think that's
yeah,
absolutely a fantastic one for any team that wants to actually be good. You can't sit around and wait for someone else to lead you in the right direction. You have to take part of that and take charge of that. And I think that's really, really powerful. I realize we're getting on so many different topics, which I think is good, but I do
yeah.
want to come back to a couple of the other ones. So leaders have
Well, just
qualities that set
the
them apart from ordinary people. Is number two.
yeah, just I mean, just going back to your sort of responsibility on the player's behalf. I mean, that would that would fall under the umbrella of the leadership process. So the leadership within that team, if you were acting as that head coach, would would give them that space
Mm,
to demonstrate that they have adhered to those wishes, I suppose,
mm,
and they have done their part. And I think that would come out of that leadership process, and that sounds quite healthy. If it was clear and it was needed, and it would be effective if that was fitting for the nature of that individual player. So, for example, if you had a veteran player that wanted to have more of an imprint on the team strategy and to demonstrate the effort that they're willing to put in to maybe inspire others and be role models for others on the team, and you gave them that space as their coach, like that just seems like effective
mm,
leadership. But and you can see it echoes this point that you can see how it encapsulates everyone. So
mm.
it's not just leader as an individual directing team, it's involving them. So maybe as you
Yeah.
say, I think a lot of people that might listen to this will be like, well, it's not new, but anyway, it's just one of them.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and I think that there can be multiple different levels to it as well. Like
Mhm.
I love, as well as having individual players, I think that the role of the captain is completely underutilized in League of Legends and in mostly in esport from what I've seen. I think a little bit better actually in some games like CS and Valorant from what I've seen, but we'll stick with League of Legends for now. And having that again, talking on both sides, right? Your privilege as a captain is you get to be in one of the meetings a week. We'll have a captain's meeting where you get to actually have a voice on what we might learn for the next week. I think that's always a good one. But your responsibility is to be that bridge between the players and the staff. And when we have these meetings, just like, as we'll come on to, just like the rules I have with other coaches, in the staff meeting or in the captain's meeting, if you think what I'm saying is wrong, I absolutely want you to tell me. Not only am I okay with it, I will not be okay with you not telling me. Like it's your, again, responsibility to tell me if you disagree with me. But once the decision is made, you have to then support that decision as if it was your own. And the same
Mm.
applies for the captain. So you can you sort of spread things out and have different levels and give people different areas to work on. And to be honest, I mean, I won't use names, but a few times I've worked with players who either, well, who had reputations for being very difficult, and oftentimes I can understand where that reputation came from. And to be honest, I think pretty much in all cases, the thing that helped the most was giving them some form of leadership. So not okay, let's give this person less and less because they have a tendency to be quite toxic or whatever it might be, or they have the tendency to be a difficult teammate. It's the opposite. It's let's give them more. and
Mhm.
people thrive like that. So I'm a massive fan of however you'd call it, decentralized leadership, or everyone having a properly defined, properly talked about areas that they are responsible for.
Yeah. Excellent point. Nice example. Again, stemming from this paper, one of the things they talk about and flag is distributed leadership.
Mm,
And we're seeing that it's certainly in the last decade with I think a lot done by researcher, Professor Katrien Franzen, from the University of Leuven in Belgium. She did a lot of work around identity leadership and creating an athlete leadership. And so athlete leadership will be this idea that there are different leadership roles within a team, and they're not all a head coach. So even amongst your playing staff, you'll have informal leadership roles. So emotional leader, like a motivational leader, the sort of the team prototype who represents the team. And so you can see how a team captain sort of fits within there. And they're not necessarily, the team captain is more of a formal leadership role, but you might even have just a social role or a social leader within the team that just brings the team together outside of training hours and things like that. And so different roles, different responsibilities, but the leadership is distributed, and it doesn't all the responsibility for leadership is not situated within one person.
mm,
And that seems to be a very healthy way of leading a team. What's really interesting is some work that looked at what happens if you don't have a leader to begin with in a group that's assigned a task. What happens?
mm,
And certainly in some laboratory work, people sometimes elect a leader and then get behind them because it was a
mm,
choice. Sometimes different groups take control of different parts of the work, and that seems
mm,
very healthy.
mm,
And in one study, and I'm not saying it's always the case, but one laboratory study, a leader was nominated by researchers, and it was based on certain traits and characteristics this person was said to have. And as a consequence, performance in the tasks they were assigned actually decreased because everyone deferred.
mm,
Everyone deferred to this person,
mm.
thinking
That's really
you have
interesting.
knowledge, characteristics, all the answers. And so you can see actually in that very,
Mm,
very specific laboratory setting, having a formally appointed leader that was appointed by people who had control and power was actually relatively detrimental.
yeah,
So
that it reminds me of two things that I wanted to. One I was already going to bring up, and one I don't know enough details of it off the top of my head, so we should really look into it. And I'd love actually to make it a whole topic for next week, maybe. I think I'm right in saying that either last year or the year before, might even be the year before that, one of the recent years, Harlequins in the Premiership in rugby, they didn't have a coach for a substantial part of the season, and things went unbelievably well without a coach. And so again, I'm not. We shouldn't go into it more now because I can't remember the exact details. But I remember hearing their director of rugby talk about it and about this kind of stuff that they went through and what they did. And they
wow,
actually, I don't know. I assume they got a coach since. I actually don't know. But I think they genuinely did consider the idea of just carrying on. Like, what if we just don't have a head coach? What if
goodness
we're
me.
just all doing it like a committee, and people just doing their own thing and just carrying on doing their own thing, which I think is a fascinating thing to talk about. But okay, so that we'll couch that for another time. And the other thing
Yeah.
that I was going to talk about, which actually comes onto this, like leaders have qualities that set them apart. Are you aware of the Peter principle? I think it's called colloquially. The idea
Not sure.
that
No, I think so.
um, people in a hierarchy tend to rise to their first level of incompetence. So you do well at a role, therefore you're recognized for doing well, therefore you're promoted. And let's say you do well at that role, then you're recognized for doing well and you're promoted. And then on that third role, you're not doing so well. You don't do very well, so you don't get promoted. So you just stay at that level.
Just stay. Oh my
And
gosh.
really what actually just happens in so many organizations is you get promoted until you can't do your job very well anymore. And basically there was a few studies where they wanted to do one in politics, but I don't think they have. If you pick people at random to get promoted, the results are based like they're the same. If you pick the
Hmm.
best performer, or if you pick just a random person who could be half-assing it and could be not producing very much, the results are like the same because there's a few
Hmm.
things. Firstly, it's very hard to select for what qualities actually would make a good leader in this context. And like you say, I think that can also be the case. Could be that leader they selected was perfect for a different group. And the other
Yeah.
thing is that you also lose the person if you promote your best salesman. Now you don't have the salesperson anymore. They're not selling
Right.
things; they're the manager, um, which I think is just an absolutely hilarious thing to kind of to consider. And that does happen even in esports as well, right? There's people who have been around for a long time, and so they have a certain level of seniority, and maybe
Mm.
again, I'm not going to say any names. They would be perfect at another role, but the thing is that we have this weird idea. This is slightly less relevant to performance because mostly people have a job, a role that they want to do. But we have this idea that getting kind of promoted up the hierarchy in terms of a job is like a reward in itself. And I don't
Mm.
know how, but for me, I think it would be much more healthy if we could somehow remove that. And it's like the person who's the manager of these 5 people is technically more senior than them in the structure of the company, but they're only there because they would be a good manager or they want to be a manager. Even just that would be enough. They actually want to be managing people rather than, I don't know, selling. And the salespeople could be paid more if they're better performers, and the manager, if we could somehow find a way to disconnect the two, because everyone just wants to be promoted. And it does come, I guess, a little bit in sport where we're starting to gradually get away from it, but there is still this idea that every assistant coach wants to be a head coach. And for me, I
Yeah.
just think the jobs are completely different. And the best assistant coach in the world would be a bad head coach, and vice versa.
Right.
Not just, someone who's good as an assistant coach could be a good head coach. But I think the more you get better at one of them, the less you would suit the other position. So it was just a bunch of my thoughts on this thing of like leaders have qualities that set themselves apart. I do think there are qualities that make people good leaders, or at least the good leader for that group, which again makes
Mhm.
it a lot more confusing. But I think it's just so hard to identify what those qualities are, because
Yeah.
performing well at your current level, this is the Peter principle, that does not work. We know we know for sure that does not show that you would be a good leader. But I
Yeah.
do think there are, I mean, we talked about, EQ or all those kind of things, or being able to learn. Like if there's skills that make you a better coach, then there must also be attributes that set you apart to be more likely to be better as a coach, I
Yeah.
guess.
Absolutely. Well, that's you've summarized very well there a lot of the sentiments within some heavy hitters in the research world. So this idea that if you really look at it, there have been lots of studies to try and identify the trait, the characteristic of perceived leaders, great leaders, and nothing, nothing carries over. Nothing is necessarily always the one trait. So personality traits are a big one. Looking at things like openness to experience, conscientiousness, things like that. In some contexts they work, sometimes not, but it doesn't necessarily explain the effectiveness of a group of group performance. And so doesn't appear to be one constellation of traits or characteristics that really works for every leader in every context. But actually, one of the things that's most effective it seems, in terms of developing good leaders, is looking at self-awareness. So it's back to your coach talk, mystery guest. That seems to be on the money there, where if we can just develop our ability to lead ourselves and be aware of our actions and behaviors and sort of understand why we're involved in leading and why we're involved in that coaching position, and if try and make some sort of coherent sense between our motivation for doing it, our way of doing it, our values for guiding us in it, that seems to be pretty good. And I think that self-reflection, self-awareness is also very important, because it might allow you to understand the needs of the group you're working with, and if you can work from those needs, being adaptable to those needs, that seems to be
Mm,
an essential part of it. So
mm,
we spoke last time about, can you just take one approach and put it into another team, and with the caveat being that maybe a team wants that approach and players want that approach. I think being adaptable, being sensitive to those needs, and having the self-awareness to realize, are you taking them on board, or are you selectively choosing them to fit what you actually wanted to do in the first place, and how you do it. I think that's probably a characteristic of a great leader. But the paper was just saying the zombie idea is that there are these leadership ideals, and if somebody has them, they are a great leader.
Mm.
So
Yeah. No, and I think we both agree that that's not the case. But the two things that I think that I kind of disagree with in the statement, that so the statement in the summary is, leaders have qualities that set them apart from ordinary people. The two things that I would say is, even though I do believe they do have qualities that set them apart, I don't believe they're the same qualities through all
yeah,
leaders. And the other
yeah,
thing that I really don't like, and this is what I was trying to get at with this Peter Principle thing, is setting them apart from ordinary people. I think we somehow don't think it's possible. As I keep as I think about it, but it'd be great if we could somehow split apart this idea that a leader is like, well, ordinary people is the words that I'm sort of taking umbrage with. The idea that you've got the leader and then the like
yeah,
less important people. And especially when
yeah,
we're talking about a team, we can come on to this later with number 3 and number 4. But yes, I do think coaches are incredibly important. But I think everyone should be thought of as individual. Everyone has qualities that set them apart from everyone else. And this idea
definitely.
of ordinary people is just really not helpful. And so
Yeah,
leaders have leaders have qualities that set them apart from the rest of the people in the group, but those qualities might be completely different to another leader. That's how I would kind
yeah,
of reform this one to make it alive again, at least in my mind.
yeah. And I fully agree with what you're saying, and I think it is. We can apply it to esports, and an asterisk here that we haven't got good research, depth of research on coaching and leadership in esports. So, like objective studies of what works and what isn't, what it doesn't work is just not there yet in esports. But certainly, you can see the impact of maybe bringing in a super high profile head coach to a relatively inexperienced roster. You can just imagine the level of like deference, the level of, oh, this guy, this head coach, this role is has all the answers and has done it all before, and therefore I have to listen to every word and do my best to do absolutely everything as instructed. You can see how that might not be optimal. So yeah, awareness of that would be useful perhaps.
Okay, and that
And
leads us
again,
on
yeah,
to number 3. Group success should be attributed to leaders. This is a again the thing with all these ideas is that I think they do have a little nugget of truth in them, and that's what
yeah,
maybe keeps them stumbling around, if we stay on the same zombie analogy. So
yeah,
for me, the weird thing that I would say is that in esports, maybe it's changing now, but in general, not that much is attributed to the coach, and maybe it should be a
yeah,
little more. But then the other
hmm,
thing that I'm thinking, actually, as I'm saying that, is no, I'm thinking maybe we've gone too far the other way now, where especially in the ERL system, results are attributed to the coach without seeing the strength of the roster.
hmm.
So there's a really interesting, you might actually know, this is the thing that's so fun about these conversations. I don't know the study, but I read a book that talked about the study. I don't know if you've actually seen the real study.
I probably don't know the
Um,
book.
so there was a study that someone did looking at basketball teams and evaluating the rosters, I think based on some statistical things, and then saying how much better or worse than your projected wins did a coach do. And all the coaches, pretty much bar one, Popovich, were basically exactly as you'd expect.
Mm,
They did as well as the roster should do. And I think in esports, I think this is mainly due to actually just the fact that the way we search and interview coaches is, I think, probably still our weakest area.
mm,
But we do forget that sometimes. And someone who won an ERL is like, okay, that coach won an ERL. And then you don't look into the fact that I've seen situations where there's one team in this ERL who are paying 20 times more than anyone else, and they're the only full-time team in the whole league. And so they're working twice as long as well, and they won. And they just
mm,
about won. They maybe won like 3-2 in the final and they came second in the regular season. And it's like, well, that coach won. And it's like, I mean, yeah, true. But maybe the person who came second with a part time team and infinitely smaller budget and no players that you recognize actually is the coach that you should be looking at. And so I actually, because I even wrote down, we should attribute more success to coaches than we currently do. But as I'm talking, I'm thinking the opposite. And even Guardiola once said at one point, someone asked him in a press conference, how are you the best coach? And he just instantly said, I have the best players.
Mm.
I think that's a good way to think about it.
It's probably, yeah, it probably impacts it, no doubt. I'd be inclined to agree with you, though. I do think in esports generally, we maybe underappreciate the role of the coach. I don't think that's too controversial to say. I think this year of all my years in esports, I think this year has been the year where I've picked up on more openness to input around developing and supporting coaches. And so I think that's acknowledging that coaches are important, and maybe the industry just needs to get a bit clearer on what it exactly means to be a good coach. But yeah, I do think that it might be linked to player salaries in some of the
Mm,
major games, like
mm,
the weight that carries. Does it naturally overshadow the coach's role a bit?
mm. I think maybe as well, now you're, once you mentioned that, I think maybe actually the things that I'm dealing with are actually two different things. I think
Mm,
that we don't put enough attribution to the coach, but both for players and for coaches, we put far too much emphasis on results. Maybe
yeah,
that's a better way to think about it. So it's not
yeah,
that we think the coach won, it's that we see that they won and that's a big deal. Whereas I think that it's not. Basically, it's
yes,
not. I think, especially if you're talking about one split for sure. If you're talking about a year, probably the results shouldn't be a big thing in how you find talent. They're the easiest thing to do, and they're also the most expected thing to do. So it's the best for your own job security. If you're finding a coach and they won everywhere else, and then you get them and they lose and they're horrible, then you can say, well, they won everywhere else, and it's probably not your fault. Whereas if you get someone through a proper process that you've built up and they hadn't done well before you, and then they do badly, probably it's your fault. So you
yeah,
can understand why people are scared to do that and why we just default to results. But yeah, on this
yeah.
topic, I do think we should attribute probably more to the coaches than we do, while forgetting the results if possible.
Yes, definitely. And I think we've spoken before about if we could, we'd rather judge coaching relative to, or even team performance relative to the resources available.
Mm,
I think we had this conversation on our Coach Talk podcast, and just knowing teams' budgets would
I'd
be
love that.
interesting to
So
like
fun.
weight the league table. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this paper makes an interesting point that for them, the attribution of all of the success to a leader, they actually make the point that they think it induces narcissism, complacency, and unwillingness to listen in the coach.
Yep.
And
Yep.
now, I do. I actually, I would think I would concur with you that actually more recognition of the role of the coach in esports would be generally a good thing and a healthy thing. But I could also very quickly see that if we, yeah, yeah, if we go down
Yeah.
down that path, in some cases, that
Yeah.
might be an outcome.
Yeah.
So
True. True.
tread carefully, perhaps.
Mm. Okay, and then the last
Yeah.
one. This one's a bit strange. I mean, it doesn't apply as much, obviously, to something like esports. History is ultimately the story of great leaders. If we were to say like esports history is, that's definitely players, obviously,
Yeah.
for us, and I think that's probably correctly so as well. That's, I guess, another thing to throw into to make it even more confusing, 'cause if it wasn't already enough, is that if you look back 5 years, or especially if you look back 10 years, probably the coach didn't have all that much impact, and so it was
Mm.
okay to kind of ignore them when we think about the history. But maybe we should be thinking more about the coaches that are with this player. I do think it's the combination. I mean, there's a fantastic book, The Captain Class, which is basically making that point that the history of sport is not the history of great coaches and great leaders of teams. It's great coaches working with great captains, or kind of that next level down of leadership. And actually, also it does talk about then the next level down on that as well. But if you look at all these all these kind of situations from sport, it's often the case. It's Hansen and McCaw. It's not just Steve Hansen, or whatever it might be, and that
Mm,
does tend to be the case more often than not, I think. So
yeah.
maybe less about sport, but an interesting thing. I mean, I guess the thing with history is probably just a practical thing. If you're leading an army of hundreds of thousands, we should probably just focus on one person. Otherwise, it's going to be too confusing.
Yeah, it's difficult to write the autobiography of the biography of every single one of those individuals. Yeah,
Exactly.
no, for sure. Um, how would this? How could I fit this to esports? I suppose definitely the idea is that we tend to, where we perceive a leader to be effective, or the outcomes to be impressive, we tend to give them a bigger share of the
Uh,
well done.
yeah, I have an idea. Again, the word leader rather than coach.
True.
So,
Right.
do we attribute too much to the story of one player on the team rather than everyone else? So,
I can see that.
Faker, for example,
Yeah.
is it Faker or is it his whole team? And that's actually a really, really interesting discussion. There was a few people, I think in Cagel tweeted this at some point, something like, uh, Zayas has been a professional player for 3 years. He's been in 3 world finals and he's won 2 of them. The next Faker is not playing against him. He's sitting next to him or something like that. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, because I can definitely see both sides where you say, yeah, if you just look at that without knowing any of the details, that's a more impressive start than Faker had. That's the most impressive start of any League of Legends esports player by a substantial way. I know they haven't done particularly well domestically, but still. But on the other hand, you do have to say, yeah, but can he do it without sitting next to Faker? And it's the same in Europe. Caps gets way more credit than anyone else for winning all these titles, and he gets the best team not only because G2 spend the most money, but also because everyone wants to play with Caps. So
Right.
he does actually have a bigger input on getting a better roster than anyone else. They can pick from any player ever, because who wouldn't want to play with Caps?
Hmm.
And he is the best, but how much of it is other people? So maybe that's a way to kind of bring it in. Like, is the story of great teams, how much of it is the one great individual that we always name, and how much of it is the whole team performance?
Yeah, the supporting cast, the pieces all fit and come together at the right time. Yeah, no
Like
doubt.
Pippin and Jordan. Like, how much is Jordan? How much is
Yeah, exactly. And also, just I mean, I was thinking exactly of that example. Like in The Last Dance, there's that wonderful moment about, I think, Steve Kerr, a role player, stepped up to hit a big shot at the right time, and yeah, it's just the world of competitive team sport and esport, isn't it? It's the sum is greater than
mm,
the total of each individual part. So no, the performance is better than
yeah.
greater than the sum of the parts.
So,
I think that's just a wonderful way of looking at it. Like it's very complex.
mm,
It's difficult to boil it down into any one role, or explain performance based on any one attribute or characteristic, or
mm.
role. And I think it's just fun to think about.
So how would you answer if I pushed you for an answer? And I asked first, so I can think while
Okay.
you answer.
Yeah.
Is esports history too much just the story of one great player and not enough the story of the teams? Let's just stick for League of Legends, because I don't know enough about
Hmm.
simple teammates or whoever.
Something actually tells me teams, because I'm just like analyzing my own experience, and I was more familiar with legendary teams than individuals just by name. Um, and I'm more aware of good runs by a specific team than I am by the individual on the team. Now, I don't know why that would be. I'm thinking recently of
Mm,
like Eintracht Spandau and like ERL teams that have made historic runs and things like
mm.
that.
Yeah,
It could just be my own lack of knowledge about individual players. Maybe
yeah.
that's a cop
Well, I
out
think
answer.
as well in ERLs it does tend to be more team based, because people who are that good go very quickly to the
Hmm.
LEC. So they don't tend to
Right,
make a name for themselves that much.
right.
In ERLs, you have players either we literally have a player this year skipping from a Division 2 to straight into the LEC, which is the first time that's happened. But Still, people do it very, very quickly. Because I think I would probably say the opposite, and I say that as a massive fan of Faker and a massive fan of Caps as people and as players.
Hmm.
And it is hard to pull it apart because T1 could play with anyone because everyone wants to play with Faker, and anyone in Europe wants to play with Caps. But if
Yeah.
you forget that part, especially, then I do think they end up getting our
But when
history is too
you
much about the story of great leaders in the game rather than about the whole team.
right, what about like Fnatic though? Like, is the history like the world's run of Fnatic? Is that a player for you, or is that
Well, Caps
true?
again. I think I think it, I think it I
It could
think it
boil down
kind
to
of
him.
is.
Okay.
I do well, obviously, and this is the thing: is that I don't think it should be, but I think
Mhm.
it's fair to. It's probably recognised a lot as that, and of course, it's partly due to the fact that Fnatic were winning everything, and then one player goes to G2, and then G2 are winning everything, and then everyone else keeps changing stuff, and we have little blips, but no one has really like since it's become the LEC. Caps has won like 90% of the titles or something,
Yeah.
or like maybe even over that now, especially after last year. Maybe it might well be over that. He might have lost like one or two,
Mhm.
and he was probably in the finals of one of them. So
Yeah.
you can, I think, make a decent case. But I also think that he had the best roster around him during those moments, and that's the part that
Mhm.
we should maybe put a bit more of an
Yeah,
emphasis on.
certainly. And in the context of this paper, there's a lot that we don't know about those teams, and it could be that for each of those successful runs, it has just been the the model of good leadership, in that perhaps the leadership of that team was such that it was optimal for Caps. So how he wanted to play was maybe how they played, and they allowed him space to express those views, and they accommodated them.
Mm,
And so we can't know that, but it could have been that there wasn't a single voice determining how everything goes, and it was distributed perfectly, and it all came together.
mm.
It may not necessarily. I think maybe this is where it's easy to say he was a constant, therefore he was the reason.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and also it does. It's not a very necessarily a good one to one because I've no idea if Caps has any leadership role. He could just be the
Right.
best individual player, and they play around Caps, even though he doesn't lead. Faker, I think it's pretty hard to deny that that he does, especially considering how all his teammates talk about him
Yeah.
after the fact. And they had that fantastic for history moment of playing with a different player, and everyone played so much worse, and then he came back in, and everyone was so good again.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so we'll move on. We'll move on from that because while I do think it's an absolutely fantastic or fascinating discussion, it's less. We kind of got on a bit of a rabbit hole, less useful information and more
Yeah.
just fun. Any last things on the paper before we get to our couple of questions for this week?
No, I suppose summary takeaway that is practicable for people would just be to consider, if you're in the role of a coach, consider how, and we'll touch on this I think in future episodes, about you're maybe not in control of everything, and how your effectiveness is determined largely by, or it involves the others in that team setting. Don't let it go to your head.
Mm,
Success, and be self-aware enough to realize that you want to keep constantly checking in with what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what
mm.
others need.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
that's,
think that's really
yeah.
good. That's definitely very, very good. And yeah, think of yourself as one of the members of the team, even if your role in
Yes.
a hierarchy might put you above them. You're
Yeah.
if you're five players and a coach, you're a sixth of the team's performance or something like that. I think is a much more healthy way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I think that's a good takeaway. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question, which comes up a lot, we hear more and more about the power of listening. We hear people talk about active listening. Absolutely fantastic phrase, I think, just to get people more aware of what we actually are starting to mean. How do you get better at listening is a question that I've been asked
Mm.
many times, so we should jump into it here.
Yeah. So just in a brief scanning of some of the work that's been out there on this, I think active listening comes up a lot when you search about it, like how to get better at it, and sort of bring it to mind, make it a conscious point for you. And one of the techniques I think is linked is often hinted at is paraphrasing, so summary statements. So if you listen with the intent to repeat back what you've heard, you're actually paying attention. Whereas if you listen to find times to insert your own rebuttal or your own information, you're maybe less likely to be listening. And I think that's useful for some people, but I think it's relatively known that if you can summarize what someone's just said, you're likely to be listening pretty well, and it's probably going to make you a better listener the more you do it. But one area I thought was actually just quite interesting was prior to entering a scenario where you feel listening might be important, just to ready yourself. So I think there was a mention of our own biases, like I'm going into a situation, what do I feel actually like I'm looking for, and what do I feel like I want to hear? And being aware of that when you're in that situation, can you actually practice thinking, well, what doesn't fit with the puzzle that I wanted or the painting that I wanted to be painted? So you might give yourself just that brief moment of awareness to realize, what do I go into this expecting, and therefore what information am I looking to pick up on that might confirm what I wanted to hear? And being aware of that, you might then be able to bring your attention to sort of other things that you might not have been expecting or might maybe not want to hear. And that was interesting, like how might you go about doing that? And it could just be as practical as taking your time. So
Mm,
before you jump into a scrim block, taking a moment to set out what your goals and hopes for the scrim might be and what you anticipate might be coming
mm,
up. And then big question mark on the note paper is, and what am I missing? And then going into that space thinking like there could be something I'm missing. I
mm.
thought that was quite interesting.
The bias thing I think is really, really useful. Just as soon as you mentioned scrims, it just brought back a bunch of memories of not even going into a scrim block, but you're watching a game, especially if you're talking with other coaches and something, I mean, especially where there's emotion involved, something will annoy you, let's say, and it's early on in the game. And by the end of the game, you're so far down this rabbit hole of like, maybe even they're doing it on purpose to spite me, or it depends on
But that's not on.
how tired you are, maybe. But either way, you've had the conversation already. Like
Mm,
you've had it in your head already, maybe even multiple times, and you've prepared this point. And it's good to anticipate questions that are going to come, but be very, very careful that you don't hear the questions from the players, answer them, have an argument about it in your head while the game's going on. They're completely unaware that this situation has happened. And then you come into the discussion with all this like huge amount of baggage behind you that no one can see. And suddenly you're dealing with things in a very different way. So I think that's definitely something to bear in mind. I do think as well it is worth just kind of being aware of the things that we tend to do as
mhm.
responses. This idea of just straight away evaluating what we're listening to
Yeah,
or probing, but from the point of view of to clarify my own thoughts on the matter. Or a classic one is instantly applying it to your own experience, and this kind of same thing happened to me or whatever it might be. And I think yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people can do. I think the best thing for me that I always say is, even the fact that you're asking this question, if someone's asking me this question, it's a good sign, because it's a skill and we can start to get better at it and we can start to recognize it. And already that will be a huge step forward once you start to think, okay, how can I actually do that? Um, it's going to be more difficult for certain people. For me, for example, I have a attention problem. And so, especially online, I can find it really, really challenging and really, really draining to kind of keep bringing myself back to the conversation. And especially when I'm doing podcasts, because out the corner of my eye, I'm checking that OBS is still recording, and I'm noting down timestamps of when we move to the next topic and that kind of thing. And that makes it difficult. And as soon as I start thinking about that, I realize that the other person's talking and I haven't been paying attention, and and that can be very difficult. And so I think a really big thing for me is, especially when you're coming into a situation where you don't have all that, let's say you don't have anything else to worry about, you actually want to just genuinely be in the conversation, just paying close attention to your attention and make sure
Yeah.
that you're really putting it on the other person, I think is really, really useful. Now, for me, there's a couple of things that I found very beneficial in terms of little practical things. A lot of them come from a guy called Chris Voss, who's the FBI negotiator person, who's written a very good book about negotiation and stuff like that. And he is exactly how you would imagine him based on based on my one sentence description. He's a very deep voice, all this kind of thing. And you kind of imagine that he's going to be this big bully, but his whole thing is it's all about empathy. It's all about
Mhm.
understanding the other person. It's not necessarily agreeing. And obviously, when he's negotiating with the Taliban or with a hostage, a person who's taken hostages, he's not going to be agreeing with them, but he genuinely has to empathize with them. He has two that I really, really like. The first one you've touched on already, which is mirroring. So saying some
Right.
of the words back to the person who's just spoken. If you are struggling with it, you can also just take the last few words. But often you start to get better at identifying what are the key words. And well, not to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but my brother has been learning to be has fully trained to be a therapist, and especially psychoanalysis with this whole talk therapy basically. And it's so much about that listening and picking up the key things that someone might be saying, and even just saying that word back to them. He was literally telling me the other day, can be a very effective technique. So someone talks for half an hour and he'll just reply with one word, and they carry on for a load extra, and then next week they say, oh, you gave me such fantastic advice. He didn't actually say anything. So I think that kind of mirroring can be really, really impactful.
Mhm.
And the other one, which I think is great, is labeling. And so his thing is, if you can identify and label an emotion that the other person is experiencing, it's incredibly useful.
Mhm.
So supposedly what they found in their practice is that they now teach people how to negotiate and how to communicate. Um, is that if it's a negative emotion, it gets diminished, and if it's a positive emotion, it gets increased. So it's good
Yeah.
in both cases. So it's literally just sounds like that upsets you, or something like that, or it sounds like that's very frustrating, whatever that might be. And the reason that I absolutely love this as a little technique, apart from the fact that when you actually do it, it's useful, is that it keeps you in the conversation, because you're like, okay, while this person's talking, I'm trying to work out what's underneath what they're saying. So I'm paying attention to how they look, how their body language is, how their tone of voice is, and all those kind of things. But you have to be there, and you are actually, in fact, being active while
Yeah.
listening, because you're trying to kind of interpret underneath. And this is something that he has a great thing that he mentioned on a podcast with Lex Friedman, which is a great starting point if you don't know this guy at all, where you can practice this just with people you don't know. Because it's one of these things where if you start doing this suddenly with your players. If you've been coaching players for a year and now you listen to this and think, I'm going to try that, they're going to be like, it's a bit weird. At first, you are going to think it's weird, whether they think it will or not. And so you find kind of neutral people. Next time you go shopping, if you think the person who's the cashier looks like they're having a tough day, just say, tough day. And either
Oh,
they say, no,
powerful.
actually,
Yeah.
it's going great, or you
Yeah.
might get something else. And
Mind your own
not,
business.
yeah, yeah. I think almost invariably you will not get mind your own business. I think
No,
almost always you'll be shocked at how
someone
it's
wants to.
nice to feel seen, even by
Yeah.
someone completely random. So maybe I've gone for too many things at once, but I think those are some practical things that can be very, very helpful. So mirroring and labeling, I think, is definitely things to look into if you want to get better at listening.
Yeah. If people are particularly attentive to what's going on screen during this, you might have seen me looking away to a different screen whilst you were talking about labeling. But I was actually just it. I found a few articles that hinted at similar things. One, I guess, similar to labeling was probing, and it was maybe seeking clarification. And actually, one of the ways they do that is by assigning a term to it, which is, I guess, kind of
Mm.
in its form labeling that then someone can either agree or disagree or expand on. So yeah, I love that one. The only other practical one I came across was the 2-second rule, which was a deliberate pause after
Mm.
someone has finished
Mm.
speaking.
Mm.
And they, I can't imagine there is empirical evidence to say 2 seconds is
Mm.
exactly what's needed, but it is an interesting. idea that you're giving enough space so that if something more needs to be said, it can be said, but you're also not hanging on too long
Yeah, I
to make it
I
awkward.
I love this one. I actually think if you're in a difficult conversation, especially with a player, for example, you can leave it far longer than that as well. I think
Mm.
it's okay, and you need to start getting comfortable as a coach with silence.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
absolutely. So this guy's son, who is also a negotiation trainer, Brandon Voss, says count thousands to yourself and don't stop until you run out of numbers. The point being, like, just sit there in silence, and you'll be amazed at what can happen. But even the 2 second rule, I think, is fantastic. I do it not on this podcast as much because, as I mentioned, I want it to be a bit more conversational, but on Coach
Mhm.
Talk all the time, because it's something that took me too long to. I was talking about this in. I just keep repeating the same stories to everyone who listen. I was talking about this with the most recent episode that I just did. In filmmaking, I've got some experience doing documentary filmmaking. And you're sitting down, you put all the lights up, you're interviewing people, asking specific questions, often questions that they're experts in. Either it's a story from their life, and if it's an interesting story, interesting enough to make a film about, they've probably told everyone they know already. So they've told this story 100 times. And it took me far too long to realize this was useful outside of filmmaking, because you very quickly see that you ask a question, they say their answer, there's a pause, then they talk a bit more. The stuff that goes in the movie is 90% the stuff that's after the pause. It's not the stuff that's before. And that's actually, yeah, like I said, took me way too long to ever apply that to other areas of my life. But that's really, really true. And if you're interested in this, and you, especially if you don't mind slightly more indie films, there's a fantastic movie called Gates of Heaven, which is Errol Morris's first documentary. And it's a documentary about a pet cemetery. But of course, it's not about a pet cemetery at
Mm.
all.
Right.
The joke was a different filmmaker said, if you can make a story about this pet cemetery, I'll eat my shoe. And he did. And so the person did make a little video of Werner Herzog eating a shoe. You can find that online. And it's because he just leaves the camera running and just lets them talk. And the most clear example of it is, at one point there's someone talking about the fact that they'd have to bury their dog or something, and then a car horn goes off in the distance, and there's a pause because it's like, oh, you're going to have to cut this out. And then she starts talking about the fact that she lent her son her car, and she doesn't like the person that he's married to, and her daughter-in-law stole the car and totaled it, and then just goes on and on for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and shows you so much of her life that is that moment after the pause. And it's almost like this whole
Mm.
film is what happens after that 2 second pause.
Yeah. Brilliant. Topics I never thought would come up on the Coach Support podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we like the 2 second pause, we like labeling, we like probing, and summary statements,
Mm,
paraphrasing, whatever you might call them.
mm.
Yeah, that all seems to be quite good. I have a question for you though. You say this is a question you get asked a lot from coaches that are sort of interested in developing. How can I be a better listener? Any sense of why they think listening is such an important thing to develop for them?
Um, I wouldn't say necessarily that if you were to ask all coaches, listening is going to be very high up on the list. But I do think that a lot of coaches who do well in esports have been able to do well without using listening at all. I think that a lot of what worked in esports in the past, and actually does still work to get you jobs and bounce around from job to job to job, is kind of a lot more vertical, and a lot more like, I come in and swinging my weight around, um, and projecting this air of confidence. And the problem is that does still work, because players have a massive say on who their coaches are, and players quite often, especially in a short time frame, respond well to people who are incredibly confident about the game and act like they know everything, regardless of whether they're right about it or not. And so it's almost like been a selection process where a lot of the coaches who are in esports have spent a lot of time either seeing other coaches or coaching themselves in a way where it's like you have to have the final say. You can't let someone disagree with you. You can't let them just carry on and explain themselves. You have to like jump in as soon as they make a slight mistake with what they're saying so that you can pick on that mistake so that you can win the argument.
Mm.
And whether they know it or not, I think a lot of times they don't. That is the situation that we're in. And so sometimes when people are starting to want to get better, that's when they come to me or yourself, or they start looking up these kind of things or listening to these kind of podcasts. That's when they might think, okay, actually, this is a skill that I hadn't really thought of as a skill. This is a thing that I hadn't really considered as a thing. Why should I be really good at listening as a coach? Why actually is that one of the, maybe even one of the most important skills that I
Hmm.
can learn? And that's where they come to ask. Where, you know, if you talk about knowing things about the game or even building systems and being structured, that's something that people are maybe already more aware of, which is why I actually get asked it. Well, I mean, structured, I get asked it even more, but something that's a bit more obvious might be asked less because people are more accepting that that is something that they would be working on. Whereas if
Hmm.
I'm the first person they've heard talked about the fact that you should shut up as a coach, more often than not, you should shut up more than you're doing probably. And I
Yeah.
should say that to myself as well. That's
Yeah.
that's where it might come, I think, as a question.
Fantastic. Really interesting. Partly because I'm a big fan of a metaphor for coaching as orchestration. So this idea that the coach is an orchestrator of very skilled sections, and
Love
they
that.
are sort of responsible for bringing it together. And it within it, it implies that actually the coach isn't always in complete control. And within that, if we're not in complete control, we have to uh, notice things to be able to pick up on where the limits of our control are and what needs doing at certain times and where we can pull a few strings to hopefully bring about a reaction or a response or a consequence that we deem preferable. And actually, the art of noticing has received sort of more attention in the coaching space. So how people can be better attuned to what's going on and how they might respond in a good way. And listening would be a big part of that. So like, how can you notice what's going on where you can listen is like a first port of call. So it's just interesting to see how that is really quite topical
Mm.
in sports coaching at the moment.
Yeah. And we have in sport and in esports, we're very comfortable with it when it comes to the game. The idea that a
Yes.
better coach might be able to see things that happen in the game that you don't see. We're very comfortable with that. But we don't think necessarily, although again, we're starting to, that a better coach will be able to see things in a conversation between two players that you don't see.
Hmm.
And to be honest, I would argue that the latter is probably more important, to be able to
Yeah.
pick up on things between the dynamic that don't get said and notice when someone is struggling or notice when
Yes.
something is starting to break down and you can actually catch it before it breaks down rather than wait until it explodes and everyone can see it. And
Yeah.
now, you know, it is actually that I hadn't thought about it like that, but it is actually a very good analogy where, you know, a expert coach in the game might be able to tell that you have problems setting up objectives before you lose a game by messing it up in a competitive stage match, and they might be able to start to put in some things that fix it before you get to that stage game, and that's great.
Yeah.
But also a good coach should be able to notice the signs that you might struggle in this certain dynamic or in this certain area, or this person might be starting to struggle, and fix it before they struggle to the point where you lose games because of it. And
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting thing to kind of pick up on, but we sometimes never. I don't know. I was going to say we don't get the obvious part, but we actually do. We just tend to then duck responsibility. Suddenly there's a massive blowout, and you're like, well, when there was the blowout, I did this and that, and I responded to it in a great way. But I had a conversation this off season where someone was saying, what would happen if someone just left Discord while you were coaching and you're coaching online? And for me, if the first time you notice there's a problem with someone is when they hang up Discord and
Yeah.
refuse to answer your calls, it's gone wrong months before that. Like
Yeah.
there's no one who, you know, unless they're, I don't know, a genuine psychopath who wants to try and disrupt your team. That's not an excuse. There's not an out as a coach to just say like, well, in this massive blow up,
on
I
them.
responded in a good situation. Okay,
Yeah.
great. That's like saying we lost the final because we couldn't set out Baron properly, but afterwards I told them how to set out Baron properly. It's like it's too late. So
Yeah.
how are you going to develop those skills to find that? And I do think listening is potentially the best one for finding those things, and listening not just when you're in a conversation with someone else, but listening to the conversations that are happening around you is good. And that's why I think it's so important for at least one of the coaches on your team to be very quiet. And
Hmm.
it can be so powerful to have that person who's almost like your listener. If
Yeah.
it's not something that you naturally are doing, and you're listening to this, firstly you can get better at it. Try the things that we've talked about and practice them, but also make sure that there's a person on your staff who fills in that hole, someone who really is just, I'm happy to be silent, I'm happy to not say anything all day, because I'm going to spend most of my time finding these cracks before they happen.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also encourages coaches to find ways to spend more time checking in with the individuals and really trying to uncover more about the team dynamic than what is available just in that training environment. And harder, of course, for online remote teams, but it underpins the reason why we might want to check in once a week for 15 minutes with a player, just to give us more scope to notice
Mm,
important things. So
mm.
yeah, good
Yeah,
stuff.
and I think the maybe it's the older I get, or the more that I look into it, the more that becomes a bigger part of what I would want to do. Um, if I so just thinking about this because I was talking about it with different people over the last few months. If I was to be in person somewhere with the team, I would want to be kind of checking in with everyone every day. And yes, it would mean that I couldn't do certain things, but absolutely connection with players is number one
Yeah.
kind of priority for me. And I ideally, I want to know that something's wrong before they know something's wrong, if
Right.
I could ever get to that stage. But at the very least, as a coach, if you're listening to this, if you ask someone how they are and they say fine, and just wait, see what happens. See what happens if you just don't say anything.
I want to give that a 20-second rule.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You should have like a paper where it's like, how long should I pause, depending on how generic the answer is. The more
Yeah.
generic, the longer the pause.
Is an inverse relationship between syllables and pause. Yeah. I like it. Any other questions?
Well, I had one actually. Well, I have a different question that is tied on to the fact that we were just talking about, which I will get to. But something that came up right near the end, I was re-listening to this podcast to make sure I had all the like quotes right and the practices right and all that kind of thing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on it. He was talking about the fact that he needs to go and practice labeling, Chris Voss, again, because he's getting a bit worse at it. And he said a line: "Emotional intelligence is a perishable skill."
Ooh,
What do you think about that? If it's a learnable skill, then doesn't it have to be perishable? Because
blimey. Yeah. As in, you've got to keep your
you've got to
tools
keep practicing
sharp
it. You've got to
and
be
yeah.
sharp. Yeah.
I've never come across that, never thought of it that way. And that is probably indicative of how scientific research tends to go. We tend to seek to confirm positive things and broadcast them. And actually, to say that emotional intelligence actually might deteriorate over time, or to identify cases where it has, might be less favorable to talk about and write about. That's really interesting. Gosh, that's interesting. It makes sense,
Mm.
and
It feels true. Whether it's
it
true or
feels
not,
true.
I don't know if that helps.
And I'm probably not able to articulate a good enough scientific answer to this, but I do think that just the what's said about coaching is that it's a process. It's an ongoing process, a continuous process, and a key part of that process is understanding the needs of people, and those needs will change. And if you empathize a lot and form an opinion of someone and expectations around their behavior, and you never you never seek to check them again, that's likely to be detrimental to the effectiveness of your coaching. And why might you not check in or continue to engage in those behaviors? Maybe your self-awareness and your awareness of your behavior and your awareness of your beliefs and biases aren't so clear as they were, and that would be an argument in favor of you've sort of lost a bit of your tendency, your
Yeah.
disposition to be empathetic.
For me, I would just say, again, I don't know if it's true, but for me, it just seems like most skills kind of work in that way. It's not like you use it or you lose it, but it's like, well, not as simple as you use it or you lose it, but your skills will also regress without practice. They get better with practice. And if you don't practice them, they will regress. If you stop practicing labeling and stop trying to identify what people are feeling underneath what they're saying, then when you start again, you'll be worse. But just like with any other skill, you don't fully lose it. It just goes down a bit for a while, if that makes sense. So, as an example, I used to play a lot of squash when I was little, and then now I play racquetball like once a year or something, and I'm not good, but I get better by the end of the 2 days of playing. I'll be much
Right,
better than anyone else who just played for a day.
right.
So it's like you relearn the skill quicker, but you do need to keep sharp, I think, especially when you're talking about you want to be a coach at the highest level, that kind of thing. You do need to keep this in mind. But yeah, it's just something that I hadn't heard. So maybe a perishable skill is maybe not the right way to think about. Are there
Well,
skills
no,
that are non-perishable?
I
Actually,
think it's actually critically important to think about it like that, because
okay.
we're so quick to jump on psychological skills, attributes, experiences when they are seen to be positive. So if you think about gratitude, just on a relatively surface level, we tend to think of gratitude as something that once we engage in it, we're better at it, and it comes with all these positive outcomes, and we do it more.
Mm,
Mindfulness,
yeah.
if whether it's through meditation or something, the more we do it, the better we're at it, the more we realize the positive outcomes.
Mm,
So we're quick to jump on
yeah.
that kind of bandwagon, and I'm not questioning that is in fact true. But at the same time, it then stands to reason if you do
Stop practicing. Yeah.
mindfulness and gratitude
Yeah.
less, it's going to be harder, and you'll do it
Yeah.
less, and
Yeah.
you're not that person anymore. So it stands to reason there is some
Mm, mm,
rustiness that comes into play.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. And also, I think the gratitude thing is just so massive for me. I mean, maybe
yeah,
we should save this for another whole section, but I
yes,
think just some of the best advice for life is to, let alone coaching. I do think it's also some of the best advice for coaching, but just don't let something good happen around you, think in your head that was good, and then not say it. It's just even that, like, don't miss an opportunity to genuinely compliment someone around you is
yeah.
just so useful. What one other thing that I just thought, emotional intelligence is a perishable skill. Are there examples of non-perishable skills? Can I just not think of them? Are there things that we don't just get worse at by not practicing?
Well, there are. I mean, there are. I mentioned this last week. There is a school of thought that looks at emotional intelligence, for example, at 3 different levels. So, at a trait level, you have a relatively hardwired disposition to a certain way of being, and that's things like personality. Like they're relatively hardwired. It's not to say they don't change, but you have a level of conscientiousness, a level of openness to experience that might differ from others, depending on how you measure it and when you measure it. But that's another question. You have an ability. So what's the best you could possibly do in empathizing with someone, for example? And theoretically, you can maybe work on that. And your knowledge of it, and certainly your knowledge can more quickly subside or be developed through education. And so if you look at things like traits and skills associated with those traits, like if you're naturally an extrovert, your public speaking skills might be somewhat stable. If you're, yeah, and then if I'm not a huge, I'm not, I don't tend to like talking about personality when it comes to like esports, and I don't even like entering it into conversation because I think we're not yet at a level where personality makes sense to try and introduce into esports to understand people and performance, because I think that there's a lot of other behavior
We also don't have
and
that many players. I always think about that. Like, it's a bit different when you have the 30 people in the squad are going to do this personality test. When there's 5 of us, can't we just know those 5 people? Is that
true. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the biggest bang for your buck, and if you're putting a squad together, and this is definitely a subject for another day, but it's the biggest bang for your buck is not understanding the nuances in personality differences. It's sort of understanding just the contextual situation of each player. Like, do they have to have another job to put a roof over their heads? That's going to be more important to know at the beginning than are they slightly more extroverted than player B? That's it. Just we're not there just yet, I don't think so. However, you have challenged me, and I will go away and read slightly more into this to see if there's anything there that I can make sense of.
Mm. Okay, but still, so, like, summing up the listening one is we can at least agree that we should just keep practicing them, keep sharp. So yeah, silence, mirroring, labeling, and keep doing them. He has another great phrase that I should have used before that I really like, which is small stakes practice for high stakes results. That's the thing of
Okay.
like finding neutral people. I think it's also very good for a load of other things, but still, the
Yeah.
point is that if you go up to the cashier and say, you're having a bad day and it doesn't go well, which I think actually you'll also learn it's very unlikely for it to not go well. But if it doesn't go well, you won't see them again. so,
Yeah.
so it's okay. Whereas if the first time you try labeling, it's in a conversation with a player where they're finally opening up to you and they're on the verge of something really bad is going on or something, and that's the first time you try it, that's maybe not the right place to practice. So
hmm
yeah. Okay,
One
good.
more,
Yeah.
just one more to add to the list. It's a, I, I, I'm a big believer in thinking of things through the lens of like group dynamics, and you could probably also, if you want to improve your listening as a coach, you could probably also set yourself up for some reinforcement on the side of your players. So connect them to this attribute you want to develop. So explain to them you're looking to get better at listening, so they then might expect more of these behaviors and perhaps even hold you accountable if you're not listening more, or if they're not picking up on that. And I think that co-regulation, that social regulation there, social reinforcement might be powerful.
Mm.
And it could take a lot of trust, because if you're saying to your players at the outset of a split, my aim for my own development is to listen more, and then there are those days where you just have to get something off your head, off the top of your mind, they could call you out on it a little bit. So you got
Yeah.
to trust that it's used.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although also if you're doing it consciously and you're doing it openly, then people will start to put more weight on what you say,
Yeah.
regardless. You know, if
True.
the more you listen, the more important it is when you do say something, and that can be a really interesting thing. I'm
Yeah.
definitely going to link to you this Coach Talk episode when it's out. I won't
And
go
then the
too
next
much into it because
podcast,
you'll see. Um,
in our next podcast, I'm going to be silent for 5 minutes, and I'm going to drop in one
Yeah, the only thing is
hour
we
segment.
do have to balance the fact that people are actually listening to this rather than
True.
we both just go silent counting thousands. No, I think I think that's really good. And I think being open about this is another thing. You know, we're talking about leadership near the beginning. I think we'll probably just skip the last question because I just looked at how long we've been talking. So um, we're talking about leadership at the beginning, and a lot of the kind of zombie ideas. I think a really big one for coaches that is still somehow still stumbling around is that coaches have to have the answers,
Mm,
and coaches have to be right, and coaches have to be confident in everything they're doing. And I think that's one that's incredibly damaging,
mm,
and is just somehow still seen all over the place, despite the fact that we're seeing more and more stories from just pick any sport and look at the best coaches currently in that sport. And you'll probably find there might, if you know an example that's different, put it in the comments because I would be interested. But if I think of most sports and I think of the top coaches, I just think of people who, yeah, they're incredibly confident, but they're not
yeah.
people who never say that they're wrong or anything like that. And so
Yeah.
coming to your players and saying, okay, I'm working on my listening skills, or even forgetting that, just saying, as a coach, again, this is what this person actually does. As a coach, I don't say much. I listen a lot. And so there will be days where they don't speak, and there will be multiple days maybe where they hardly say anything. And
hmm
you have to just, if you do that without saying that's what you want to do, then that can be quite worrying and it can be making people nervous. And that's also something to consider, that people do think of silence differently. So it's not always going to be the same response when you're silent. But just that thing of being open about it and being upfront about it is never a bad thing. There's never going to
Yeah.
be a situation um, where it goes badly. I actually remember I was doing a session with one point with someone who was talking about that, and they really, really struggled with ever admitting they were wrong,
Hmm.
especially when it came to discussions about the game. And it was like, we even got to the stage where I think he was like, okay, I believe you, but I still know that I'm going to really, like, I can't do it. And then we actually found a different area where he was okay with admitting he's wrong, which is around the draft. That's often something that I think, the reason I use this story is I think it actually rings true probably quite a lot of people. When you bring a point to the team and you say we should have played this way, and then you have a big discussion about it, and you kind of think that you might be wrong, but you really want to just make sure that people don't see you as wrong about the game. Often coaches, especially newer coaches, can really struggle with that. But for some reason, it's become okay to finish a draft, they lose the game, and be like, yeah, that one was on me. The draft was not very good.
Hmm.
And you ask, we went through the thing of, okay, so when was the last time you did that? And he remembered, and he said, okay, and what was their discussion? They were really supportive. They were like, oh, no, yeah, it was more difficult, but we still could have done this and this. And don't worry about it. Like, they're normally amazing and all this kind of thing. So it's like, okay, so in a different situation, you admitted you were wrong, and the response was fantastic. And actually, in future drafts, you had a lot more control because they were more happy with the idea that you weren't just going to blame it on them if it ended up in a bad situation.
Right.
And so then maybe we could apply it to this other area too. Can't remember exactly why I started that, but my point is that being open about stuff, and being
Yeah.
okay, I'm trying to learn to listen to you guys more, or I'm trying to
Yeah.
learn to hear you more, or even at the end of the day saying I should have listened to what you said rather
Yeah.
than saying what I said. I think you'll be shocked at how impactful that can be, and
Yes.
often catches people completely unawares, because players seem to have this idea that even though obviously they'll play the game and think, oh, I messed this up as they do it, they don't ever associate that with coaches, where they think the way you said it was the exact way you wanted to say it. And you never finish a VOD review and think, oh, I did that really badly.
Yeah.
And just being aware that coaching is a performance too, and you can perform badly and you
Yes.
can perform well. And there'll be days where you perform well, and there'll be days where you perform badly. And being open about that
Yes.
is really
And
powerful.
being open about what you want to work on. Like,
Mm.
what a perfect summary for a lot of the conversation today. You're not, if you're being open with your players about what you want to work on, you're not positioning yourself as the great and all-powerful leader that sits atop the pyramid of the team. Instead, you are showing that you are also a performer in the mix with this group of people. You're all looking to get better, and in the right context, that's just wonderfully powerful. So, yeah, here to that way of operating.
Great. Well, that's it for this week then. So thanks very much for listening. If you have any comments about anything that we've talked about, definitely stick them in the comments below. YouTube is probably the easiest, and we do want to kind of have a bit of a discussion around this. And if you have any topics that you want us to discuss for next week, drop them down below as well.
Good stuff. Thanks for tuning in.